Hi, I'm Steve Glickman.
And I'm Al Riley.
And we're friends.
And colleagues.
My first question for you, Al, is when and where were you born?
I was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1922.
And by my calculation, that means you're 97 years old and you had a birthday in June.
That is correct.
And I find that very interesting.
The following video interview is part of the UC Berkeley Emeriti Association's Legacy Project, which preserves the recollections and reflections of Berkeley's Emeriti. In conversation with a colleague of their choosing, Emeriti are invited to discuss their academic careers, including contributions, accomplishments, and challenges, especially as they relate to campus history. This recording is intended to provide a personal record of value to the family, friends, and colleagues of Emeriti, and to document the history of the Berkeley campus as it pertains to the individual's department, school, and college. In this video, you'll see Steve Glickman interview Al Riley. Both are emeritus professors in the psychology department.
Al, would you like to tell us some things about your early life in Illinois?
I had a wonderful childhood, and it was very, very free, and I did pretty much what I wanted to do. I think my father had given up on discipline with my older brother, and I was allowed to do just about whatever I wanted to do. And when I was about 12, we moved to another suburb, Glen Ellen, where I went to high school. And while I was in high school, I took a course in sociology. And the teacher in that course had majored in psychology, I think, probably at the University of Illinois, and talked about psychology. And I had this feeling, this is what I want to do. So I went through Oak Park, through Glenbard High School, and then looked around for a place to go to college, and this is really quite improper, I'm sure, for this sort of thing, but I had thought that the best thing I could do would be to go to a boys' school, where I didn't have to be distracted, and so I went to Wabash College down in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and stayed there for 2 years. But I discovered that their facilities and opportunities in psychology were very limited. So I concluded that I was going to leave there, and I did. And I went over to Denison University in Ohio, which had a very, very good small 4 or 5 person psychology department, and I thrived. And I also met Annie McDonald, whom I married subsequently, and spent 50 years with her. So that was very, very good. At the end of my second year, World War II broke out, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and I and many of my classmates went over to Columbus and enlisted in the Navy, in a program that allowed you to finish college and take some Navy courses while doing that. And so I finished college and ended in the spring of '43, and then went to midshipman school at Notre Dame, a famous place for midshipmen to go, and spent 4 months at Notre Dame and was commissioned in the Naval Reserve, and immediately shipped off to the South Pacific. And while I was there, I was out there 2 years, and I was on a vessel called a gunboat, and our job was to either support landings in enemy territory, or to patrol, which we did a lot of, around enemy-held islands to stop inter-island or intra-island shipping. Risky, After I'd been there something over a year, we went over to New Guinea, which is west of the Solomons, where I had been, and entered into a large group that was preparing to invade the Philippines. You may recall, probably not, that when Douglas MacArthur was driven off of the Philippines, he said, "I shall return." And this was his return. And we were an intimate part of it. Several months later, we were part of a group that supported the invasion of Luzon, the main Philippine island, north of Leyte. And while we were doing that, we were hit by a kamikaze, and it hurt our vessel considerably, and we had some people killed. It's worth pointing out, I think, that the guy who was the skipper of our ship, my captain, I was the executive officer. The captain was a year older than I. And after we were hit and our dead and wounded were taken care of, we continued on our mission, even though a large part of the vessel had been destroyed, and went and continued with the invasion group, and provided invasion support, and then later we returned to New Guinea and were repaired on a little island called Mios Wendy in Dutch, which is very windy, and the main thing I can remember is that we'd see a movie every night, and then there'd be a cocktail hour either before it or after. We'd drink too much, and the song that still rings in my ear was Rum and Coca-Cola. It was played all the time practically. It must have just come out with the Andrews Sisters.
Drinking rum and Coca-Cola.
And we had some other further expeditions, and then some months later I was returned to the United States, and spent the last year at the Naval Training Station at Great Lakes, Illinois, and Annie and I got married, and we had a cute little house out in the country, and it was the way it's supposed to be.
And Al, one of the conversations that we've had involved a visit you made home on leave, and you're home on leave when the atomic bomb is dropped.
That is correct.
On Japan.
Yes.
And that was very consequential for you, because you thought you were going to have to go back and support the actual invasion of the Japanese mainland.
That's correct.
So
that was all laid out.
So give me your thoughts when the bomb was dropped.
Well, I was downtown in Chicago on an elevated platform, waiting for a train to go north up to visit my fiancée, and I heard these guys shouting from down below, newspaper guys, and I went and listened, and they said that the war was over in effect, and I can remember the enormous sense of relief I had that I knew that I wasn't going to have to go back, that it was all over, and I didn't have to go back, and I spent the next year before I got out of the Navy as a so-called civil readjustment officer up at Great Lakes, and what we did was to discharge Navy personnel.
And now you're released from the Navy.
Yep.
And you're ready to go to graduate school, and you chose the University of Colorado. And how did that come to be?
Very interesting question. Well, when I got out of the Navy, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I got a job as a management trainee at an outfit called Bauer and Black, which was a big bandage and cotton producing company, had headquarters in someplace in the South, and I was going to become a manager there, and I found it incredibly boring, and so Annie and I packed up one weekend and went back to Denison and spent a long weekend with our pal Steckel, who was the mentor for both of us as undergraduates, and someplace along the line he said, well, if you want to think about going to graduate school, I can probably help. And he called up his pal Larry O'Kelly at Colorado and said, could you take this guy on? And Larry O'Kelly talked to his chairman, a guy named Carl Munsinger, and they said, yeah, send him out. Incredible. Just, it's the way things happened then. And it was word of mouth. Steckel said, Al is a good person. Trust him. And they, in Colorado, said, yeah, we'll take a chance on that if you say so. So Annie and I went to Colorado. We spent 1 year there, and it was a very consequential year for me. And when I look back on it, as I have many times, the really important thing was not my relationship with Larry O'Kelly, with whom I got a master's degree, but with Howard Kendler, who was a young assistant professor who had just come out of the Army himself. He was an Army clinical psychologist. He was really an experimental psychologist. He was Kenneth Spence's protege, and he was on fire. And he a brilliant young man. And I took a seminar that ran 2 quarters with him that was all of the entire history and ins and outs of conditioning and learning, Pavlovian conditioning to Hull to Spence, and it was a wonderful course and changed the way I thought about things, and I think one of the things that it did was to make it clear to me that what I really wanted to do was to do experimental research. That it was clear to me at that time that the future lay in doing carefully controlled experiments that could disprove hypotheses. So I looked around, and both Larry O'Kelly, my mentor there, and Steckel, our mentor, were both Ohio State PhDs. And so I thought, well, that's a possibility, and I applied to Ohio State and Michigan and Illinois, places that I knew. And Ohio State came back first and offered me a nice assistantship. So I took it. And I knew who was there, and it was a very strong group in experimental psychology. And so I went to Ohio State and spent 3 years there and got a PhD with Art Melton.
And what kind of research did you do at Ohio State?
I did both human and animal research. I did research on conditioning with animals, and I did research on human memory with Art. Must have talked to Art, said, what am I going to do? What happens next? And he said, well, leave it to me, or something like that. And I had job offers from Johns Hopkins and Berkeley. And I went to Johns Hopkins and spent 3 or 4 days there. It was quite wonderful. But it was clear to me that the system at Hopkins was that there was a professor and 2 or 3 associate professors and 6 or 7 assistant professors, and that if you were successful, you would get a job someplace else after you'd been there for 7 or 8 years. And if you went to Berkeley, everyone had a chance to get tenure. And I said, this is silly. Why would I go to Hopkins when I can go to Berkeley? Annie and my first wife, and I came to Berkeley in 1950, and shortly after we came here, with a couple of moves, we moved up to the top of the hill on Grizzly Peak Boulevard, and spent 50 years together up there. And she was a major force in my life and in my career, and in determining what I did and the kinds of research I did. And after we had lived together for several years, we adopted 2 children. with a couple of years apart. First Carol, and then later her brother Tom, and they were major additions to our life and have remained so. Now Annie died in 1995, after we had lived on Grizzly Peak for 50 years, I guess, and 6 years later, I had met and married Carolyn, and we continued to live there, and she also had a major influence on my life and my career, and continues to have that influence today, and it was both marriages were enormously happy and successful.
So when you arrived here, what was it like in 1950, and had Tolman and the loyalty oath figured in your calculations?
Indeed
about
they
Berkeley?
did. And I knew about it only from reading about it in the newspaper. I knew nothing about it. I wrote a letter to the chairman, C.W. Brown, and said, should I be worried about this? And he wrote back almost immediately and said, don't worry about it, come on out. And this was in the late spring of 1950.
Al, say something about what the loyalty oath was, because it was more than just a loyalty oath. It was also a disclaimer affidavit, as I recall.
At the time, as I understand it, when people came to any institution that was part of the University of California, they had to sign what was in effect a statement that I am a loyal U.S. citizen. But the loyalty oath that was imposed was special in that it said, and I am not a communist. And a whole bunch of people, like Edward, believed that they had signed the oath saying that they were loyal citizens to the United States, and they didn't have to have a special test. And so they said no. And Edward Tolman was the leader of the non-signers on the Berkeley faculty, and I think was a remarkable, brave, wonderful man.
And a wonderful psychologist as well.
And a wonderful psychologist, absolutely. And certainly had a profound impact on the rest of my life. Because I became an animal cognitive psychologist, as he was. Virtually the entire staff did not resign because of the loyalty oath. There were 3 or 4 people in psychology that did. Edward, and I think Nevitt Sanford, and Hugh Coffey, and maybe someone else, I can't recall. And everyone else stayed on. But they contributed money out of their salary every month. The entire faculty did, I think, to support the people who were out, who had decided that they could not stay. What happened was that it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't impose a special oath on a selected group of individuals in the state, and threw it out. And so Edward was reinstated, as was Hugh Coffey and Nevitt Sanford and someone else who I can't recall. And I can remember when Tolman came back, one of the first things he did was to have a seminar and talk about what he was thinking about and what he'd been thinking about. And all the troops came. It was a small seminar room, but it just jammed with, and Kresh and Leo Postman and Mark Rosenzweig and Benbow Ritchie and I don't remember who, and a whole bunch of students. And it was absolutely marvelous, because you got to see what Tolman was like.
You had a long and distinguished research career, and from the beginning, you were interested in the factors that control learning and memory in animals and people, with animal research predominating in the later stages of your career. But early on at Berkeley, you were still working with both animals and people and worrying about memory. The factors that control learning and memory.
Memory loss, how it happens. That's right, and it was certainly very important to me. At the time that I got through with graduate school, there were 2 really major lines of intellectual activity in the field of animal learning and cognition. And one of them was Tolman and his students and people like him who were essentially descendants of Gestalt psychology and thought that what they could infer from animal behavior were the kinds of mental processes that were going on in the animal's brain, and that things like where is the goal? How do I get there? Mental processes, not reflexes. The other school of thought descended from Pavlov and said, we think we can account for all of these things by the way reflexes or conditioned responses, as we came to call them, hooked together. And that was where I came from in the Middle West. The Hull, so-called Hull-Spence position was the dominant position. Out here on the West Coast, it was more Tolmanian. And fortunately, I had one mentor at Ohio State, Dallas Wickens, who was very open-minded and had, I think, no strong convictions one way or the other, was interested in what the data told him. And that influenced me greatly. So I'd had two big influences when I came here. One of them in animal cognition. One of them was Howard Kendler, who set my pants on fire, and the other was Wickens, who was a moderating influence. And I had this seminar and talked about some of the problems in conditioning and learning. And one of the things I talked about was the problem of transposition. And transposition is essentially, was invented as a experimental procedure by Curler, the famous Gestalt psychologist. And what Curler had done was to take two animals, either chickens or apes or something else, and train them with two stimuli that differed, say, in brightness or size, a quantitative dimension. And one of them would be positive, and when the animal went to that, he'd always get a reward. And the other is negative, and when he would go to that, he would never get a reward. And then after they had been trained, he moved it over like this, so that the original positive was the smaller or the dimmer, and there was a new one. And the animals almost invariably went to the new one. They avoided the original positive and went to the new one.
And he said, larger.
See?
That was larger.
Larger or brighter.
Yeah.
Whatever the dimension was, or dimmer.
Yeah.
I mean, it could go in either direction.
But they were responding, it looked like, to the relationships rather than the absolute quality of the stimuli.
That was Curler's point, that they're not responding to the Pavlovian stimulus, positive stimulus, as a point, but rather they were responding to the relationship between cues. And Kenneth Spence, who was, I think, not the most lovable person in the world, but a very bright guy, who was in the Pavlovian tradition and came from Yale and Clarkhill, and devised a scheme where he could explain transposition without responding to relationships. I described this in the class, and we talked about it, and somehow or other, I cannot tell you how, someone, either I or one of the students, no idea, and couldn't reconstruct it several years later, said, well, isn't it possible that the reason that Spence shows this declining transposition, which he said was consistent with this model, occurred because they didn't change the background. They only changed the positive and negative stimuli. Oh, and if that's true, and you change everything, keep all of the relationships constant, it turns out that animals respond relationally way, way out. There's no drop-off. It's exactly as Curler would have said. And we did that in my lab. And and it changed my life in some respects, because it was the first piece of research I did where there was a sharp, clear answer to something that was new, and it was so much fun to do that I continued persisting and doing more and more animal research, kind of in this vein.
But you had colleagues at Berkeley who were also engaged in human research, and you were rather close with some of those colleagues and published with them.
Indeed. I was very close to Leo Postman, who in some respects I think was my main supporter here at Berkeley. We became very good friends and did a lot of research together, and did some things that were a lot of fun, and did a huge piece of research on memory and forgetting.
Human memory and forgetting.
Human memory yes. Leo was strictly a human guy, but we did other things. We published a paper. I can't recall the name of it, but it was something like a disproof of Curler's theory of association, and it was great fun to do, and it infuriated Kresh. He was very upset that we little people would pick on this great man.
One of the things I noticed was that in your publication list, there are some very interesting and varied experiments with John McKee involving children, and also with Kretsch and Rosenzweig involving echolocation in rats.
That's right.
So would you like to tell us a little bit
Sure,
about those?
a little bit
lines
about
of
it.
work?
Well, I don't know whose idea it was. Possibly Kretsch's. But we had this thought. We sat and talked about this for quite some time as to how animals, what they do when they get to the goal of in a maze, and whether in fact they have any way of signaling what's been going on, whether they tell themselves or tell the world anything. And we used blind rats and would have them learn a maze, and we discovered something absolutely astounding, and that is that when they get to the goal, when they get to the correct end, they in effect stand up and holler. They emit high frequency cries that are very high frequency, well way beyond the range of human hearing, and we had fancy equipment and could pick this up, and we told a story about it, and it was interesting and fun, and I did this with them, but it was not where my heart was, and so after that I moved on. But with McKee, he was a developmental child psychologist, and I think might have been kind of looking around for the next thing he was going to do. And we talked a lot about transposition in animals and thought, wouldn't it be fun if we could see what happens to children as they get older in their ability to detect relationships between stimuli? And it turns out, in a nutshell, that they don't need any help on quantitative dimensions like louder or brighter. That's there, and if you train them on two stimuli, and this one is the positive one and it's louder, and this one is the negative, and then you move up, they just go right out with you. And children in kindergarten do that just as well as children in third or fourth grade. But if you do things that involve dimensions that are not so clearly quantitative, like the number of things they see, my recollection is that with loudness, they transpose perfectly all the way out. With frequency, youngsters have great difficulty with it. And as they get older into third or fourth grade, they understand what it is. And so we asked questions about what was going on and whether in fact they didn't understand the underlying concepts, like the concept of numerosity. And so we did experiments and that would ask questions about how much they understood of the dimension and how well that was related to their ability to respond dimensionally. And there was a close correspondence. So that was fun and interesting.
You arrived here in 1950, and Tolman was a very unusual behaviorist because he already had cognition in his head.
Absolutely. He started it with there.
But what happened in the 1960s was that the rest of psychology began catching up to Tolman.
Yep.
And figured out that cognitive explanations were the way to go.
Absolutely.
And that caused great difficulties for people we know, but somehow you adapted to that change very well. It seemed very easily. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
saying
it
it was
was.
easy, but you
No,
did
I
it.
think it was easy. And I think partly it was that I had a mixed parentage, and that I not only had this very influential young man, Howard Kendler, but I had been influenced by Wickens and Melton and people who were much more open in their views about dominant theory. And so I think it was relatively easy, and I never experienced any particular problem in moving over.
But when you moved over, I was going to suggest that the work on selective attention was immediately relevant, but you can pick any one of your research themes involving the new cognitive approach to animal learning.
Yeah, well, selective attention is a good one, and I spent a fair amount of time asking questions about what happens, and it was all animal research. What happens when an animal is put in a situation where it must attend, meaning must see, for example, more than one stimulus, and but only one of them is the relevant one, and what happens to the ones that are irrelevant but must be seen? Are they registered? Do they, or are they? Does the brain have a machinery for ignoring them? And this was a kind of a dominant theme for some time, and it turns out that what animals do in some of these situations, at least, is the stimuli that they must ignore, even though they see it, are harder to recover. In other words, they are suppressed rather than just being there and neutral, which I thought was very interesting.
And that work primarily involved pigeons?
Yeah.
And you had developed all this complex technology to both present the stimuli and...
That's correct. That's correct. And it involved, at the time, very fancy equipment and stuff that would be child's play today, I suspect.
But you developed this technology to present the stimuli and then analyze
Yes.
figuring out just what the pigeons
I
were
had some
responding
very
to.
talented graduate students that worked with me.
Which gets me to the next question on here. And I have here in front of me, you had a fine record of graduate training. Any thoughts about that? What did you do with your students that made it
I was very lucky, I think, and I don't know whether it's just luck. I was kind to students, and I suspect that might have been part of it. Is that the students were my friends, and we were colleagues together, and I had a string of wonderful students.
Yes, you did.
And remarkable. And I thought I was very fortunate, and it's fun to have people around who are as smart as you are or smarter, and it helps a great deal in doing interesting research.
Well, I'm going to come back to that in a little while, but let's switch gears for a moment and talk about your administrative jobs at the University of California, Berkeley. So I'll focus on just two of them. One was the fact that you're Vice Chancellor for Academic Development. From
What does that mean?
You're going to have to tell us that, from 1976 to 1980. But when we talked about this before, Al, I hadn't known just what you did in that job.
Yeah.
But there was one thing in particular you mentioned that sounded very interesting in terms of equal pay for equal work or something.
Well,
like that.
allocation of resources was the thing that interested me, and that is at that time, the TA money was not evenly distributed across the campus at all, and there were some powerful groups that I will not mention that had a virtual monopoly on teaching assistant money, and other places that were remarkably deprived, and I decided to be unpopular and remove money from some of these powerhouses and put it in places that I thought needed it, and that took time and kind of pushing things around. It wasn't easy, but I thought it was well worth doing. And the other thing that I remember, it's been a long time, of course, 76.
Since 1980.
Since 1980, yes, that's 45 years or 50 years. It's hard to remember, but the Distinguished Teaching Award was kind of lackluster, and I did some things that helped build that up and make it a more obvious and important thing on campus. But for the most part, I must say that although I spent 4 years doing this and I think worked very hard, I remember very little of it.
And then in 1982, you succeeded me as chair of the Department of Psychology.
Right.
And I think we both have the same attitude about that our predecessor, Jeffrey Keppel, had really done the hard work.
That's right. He was the mover and shaker. And I think after Jeff essentially reorganized the department and in effect forced it to come together as a unified group, it became easier and much more comfortable to be chair. And I thoroughly enjoyed being chair.
In 1991, the year you retired, there was a Festschrift in Berkeley involving both your former graduate students and an assortment of distinguished researchers in animal and human learning and memory. And they all assembled here, and you had a set of papers. And what are your memories of that honorific occasion?
Well, it was tremendous, and of course, I was enormously flattered and pleased by it. I remember feeling that I had to comment on every paper, that it was my job.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yes, indeed, and to say something wise and sensible about it, every paper that was given, and of course, nobody can do that, but I tried, and I remember that. But it was a lovely occasion, and a wonderful collection of people.
And it was both your former students, and in particular, was Tom Zental the organizer of that, or is
Yeah, Tom Zental and Bill Mackey.
Oh, I see. But then, in addition to a number of other former students, there were these distinguished folk from around the country.
That's right. That's
like
right.
Stuart Hulse and people like that.
Yes.
So it was quite a ceremony and an occasion.
That's
Did
right.
publications come out of it?
Yeah, there's a whole series of papers that are included in a book.
And the book was edited by Tom.
There was a major conference. It was during the time I was chair of the department. There was a conference celebrating Edward Tolman's centennial year, and many former students came back, including a group of my former students, and we had a picture taken together, and that's a picture that I treasure and wanted to have in here. And the people in the picture, from left to right, are Tom Zental, and then there's somebody in the background that can't quite be seen, and it's Herb Breitblatt, and then me, and then Charlie Leith, and Terry Lewin, and Bill Mackey, in that order. And it's a very nice picture, and was taken at that time. And they were all former students of mine who had gone on to have very interesting careers.
When you were given the Alumnus of the Year award by Ohio State University.
I'm not sure it was the whole university. I think it was probably mainly the psychology department, but I didn't pay much attention to the fine details. But I went there and was properly honored, and gave a talk, and talked mainly about my mentors at Ohio State, which I thought was something that they needed, to tell them about the people that had been there many years before.
So you're talking to them about Art Melton.
About Art Melton and Dallas
Wickens.
And Paul Fitz and their impact on me, and what an exceptional place it was when I was there, and I thought they should be proud of that.
Well, I knew at least two of those people somewhat later in their lives, and I thought both Wickens and Melton were exceptional psychologists and really interesting people.
I thought so too.
Then in 2010, you were given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Comparative Cognition Society.
That's right.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, the Comparative Cognition Society is exactly what it sounds like. It's all of the people who are interested in animal cognitive research, and they come once a year, and it's a grand meeting, and lots of people come from England and Canada, and as well as the United States and Spain, and it's a meeting of people who think about these issues, comparative issues, both in animal cognition and in comparative psychology, very broadly described. And so there will be people there that are interested in whales and all sorts of interesting things that go on at that meeting. But it's mainly behavioral rather than physiological. There's some physiology that's there, but it's mainly people who do animal cognition the way I understood it. And so every year they select somebody that they think is worthy, and invite him to come give an address and dance around the room.
And of course, you were a child in your late 80s at that point.
Yes.
In 2017, when you were a mere 95 years of age, you were celebrated as the Emeritus of the Year by the Berkeley campus. The latter award was given in part for your work with the retirement community on campus. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done for retired folk like me?
Well, for retired folks like you, I'm afraid not very much. But when you get older, it may help.
I participated in your Learning and Retirement series.
Yes, you did. So you're all right. But many people have. I was one of the founding fathers, or fathers and mothers, of the retirement center as it exists today. It was before we built it. It was a secretary sitting in an office, and she did secretarial research for both the Emeritus Association and the Retirees Association. And we thought we needed something much more serious for retired faculty and staff in general, and got some money and Bob Connick and I went and talked to the Chancellor and outlined what we wanted to do, and he said it was a wonderful idea, and he wished he'd had money, but he had
Which
no
chancellor was this?
money. Tien.
Right.
And about 6 months later, a package of money came through, and so we started, and it was essentially a full-time administrator and a half-time secretary, I think, and I and a guy named Mel Weber, who was a good friend of mine, we were both on the committee, and we thought that if the administration was going to give us this kind of dough, which was essentially, I think, $100,000, that we ought to justify it in some way, so that they would feel that it was a good expenditure of administrative out of the teaching funds, essentially. Right. And so we started the learning. Mel and I started the learning and retirement program, and what we would do is find a topic, and we sat around and invented topics. It's not hard, and then find speakers and inveigle them to each give an hour talk, and we generally have 4 speakers, and each one would give an hour, a talk for an hour, and Q&A for an hour, and we didn't pay and we didn't charge, and we made it very explicit, and people usually agreed to talk, usually, and so we had about 6 or 7 of those every year, and
that followed a theme.
Each one had a theme.
Each one had a theme.
But wildly different themes. The first one we had was on the history of the Berkeley campus, and one of the speakers was Clark Kerr. I think it's been an enormously successful and rewarding thing. We generally pull about 100 people for each lecture. A lot of people come to.
But this is open to the Berkeley public.
No.
No, it's not. Who is it? Who's there?
Berkeley retirees and
in the audience.
That's correct.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Berkeley
that.
Emeriti and staff retirees, and if somebody has a reason for wanting to come, yes, of course, but in general, it's not open to the public, and it's been going on now for 20 years.
A wonderful thing to have done. So one of the things that I neglected to ask you about, but I'd love to hear you say something about, was the research you did with an octopus.
Well, it was. I'm glad you asked that question. I was teaching a graduate seminar, and a couple of the people in it said that they thought that their octopus stuff on color change that was related to camouflage, presumably, was interesting, and how would they go about doing it? And I said, well, I don't know, but I could apply for a grant and see if we could get $3,000 or $4,000, and I did, and we did, and at first, so we would go out on the coast of Northern California, and in the tide pools out there, you can, if you're clever and know what you're looking for, you can find little octopuses, and it's a variant of. It's not like the Octopus vulgaris, which is like this. It's Octopus rufescens, which is like this, and that's about as big as they get. And they're in the tide pools, and you can scoop them up and take them home with you. And you don't need a fishing license, or at least we never had one. And we started up at the Bodega Marine Lab, and that's too inconvenient. But the good thing about the Bodega Marine Lab is that Annie and I wanted a place to stay on weekends if I was going to be up there, and we bought a house on Tomales Bay, which has been a source of great pleasure to us for 4 40 or 50 years, and has had a profound impact upon me and my family and Carolyn and my children, and it's quite wonderful, and all sorts of ramifications came out of that. But the octopus stuff, we moved down to Berkeley because it was just too much work, and I got material and built some aquaria up on the 5th floor, and had half a dozen of them up there, and we had octopuses in them, and we'd take them out and put them in a special aquarium where we would teach them to attack prey, and what we found really had nothing to do with camouflage, but it has to do with a series of color transformations that occur in octopuses when they see and make decisions about prey, and what happens. And it's a remarkable sequence of events that happens, that changes in color as they see the prey, as they observe it, as they gather themselves together and take off and stream through the water and grab it. And it's ferocious and remarkable. And we played around with that for a couple of years and wrote a paper, and they went on their way and I went back on my way. So, but it was a wonderful thing to do, and it was great fun having that lab up there. On more than one occasion, an octopus, it had a tight glass top on top of the aquarium for each creature was about this size, and they had a glass top, and they could find a way to pry open that glass top and get out, and more than once we would find one halfway down the hall and bring it back. I don't think we ever lost any, but they would escape. They're very, very wonderful creatures.
And last thing, if you wanted to be you just reminded me that we taught a course together.
Yes.
And what are your memories of that course?
That I learned about comparative psychology in it from Professor Glickman.
And I learned about animal learning from Professor Riley.
Yeah.
That we had a very good time.
Yes, it was a wonderful course.
And maybe the students even enjoyed it.
I think they did.
By way of closing this fun for me
This seance.
question and answer, I was going to go back about when we met and how our friendships developed over the years. So we met in 1962,
right,
when I was out here on a fellowship for a couple of years.
I was
with
well
Frank
aware
Beach.
of that.
But then we really became friends after I joined the faculty in 1968.
That's correct.
And you'd been here for 18 years at that point.
Yeah.
So
I was an old hand.
you're an old hand, and I was just
But it didn't take
trying
very
to
long.
figure out.
Right.
But there weren't that many people interested in animal behavior on the faculty of the psychology department. And you and I...
Was Benbow still around?
Benbow is still around, but not very much.
Yeah, and not doing much.
Not very often.
Yeah,
now.
right. So
I mean, there were physiological
that's
people
right.
interested
Mark
in,
Rosenzweig and
but
Kresch.
just being really interested in the animals as animals.
Right.
And we had a good time
Yeah.
and are still having it.
Yes, and are still having a good time.